Thank you very much. Thank you. It's sometimes great to be recognized for something that you've been pounding the pavement and getting out the megaphone over. And sometimes it's just, you don't want to be right about something and you just don't want to have to rehash it. And the majority of those of us who are working for a solution here are pretty much done talking about what went wrong and who was to blame, and are just willing to allow the Department of Justice and the FBI to do their work. So I really don't want to do a lot of finger pointing, and other than to point out where people with a lot of ethics got involved, and I think are responsible for this continuing and for it to come fully to light. I have a little, I was just going to do this sort of accidentally or whatever, but I can't do anything accidentally. So if I were to set this glass down as I'm busy talking and I was going to set it kind of close to the edge, Terry, what would you be prone to do?
Stop.
You don't have to be, dramatic. What would you be prone to do? No. I think many of us, especially those of us who have had little kids around, if they saw a glass kind of close to the edge, would just kind of, without even thinking, move it closer in, move it away from the edge. It would be our nature, okay? And I would propose that as an example of what it is in all of us, but maybe especially those of us who would call ourselves engineers and problem solvers, what it is in us to always sort of be watching for patterns. And when we see something that, there might be something to do with that, to make a note of it, to do something about it, to take note of it. And the way that we make the best products, the way that we have the best services, is when everybody works together to kind of keep track of what everybody else is working on. So that if we happen to notice something that might go wrong down the road, we can stop it from happening. We can sort of point it out and say, oh, that might be an issue. Shouldn't we do something about it, right? I have this sort of theory that what has happened that has resulted in this problem with our water in Flint is not the result of malicious characters with an intent to do harm. I think it's a lot of maybe recklessness. I think maybe it's a bit of pride. And I also think that it's something in a system that stifles our independent, individual tendency to want to fix something. And talking to a lot of students over the last year about their co-op experience and trying to draw analogies, some would say, the place I work, my job is pretty much to make sure my boss looks good. Pretty much, that's the most important thing. And if I notice that something wrong, unless I have a potential solution for it, I should probably not bring it up. Because if I do, then he'll be frustrated, and maybe it'll point something out to somebody else, and it won't necessarily move toward a solution. Instead, it'll just be negativity. And I want to keep my job, and I've kind of figured out that the climate here is such that what's most important is that I make sure that my boss looks good. And there's only really one way to do that kind of a job, and many of us, I should not say us, many do, and that's to turn off that internal keeping track and wanting to make sure things are right button. Because if you don't, well, then you go home at the end of the day and you're like, I just hate that I can't bring up this issue. I'm really worried about what's going to happen later. I just hate it that I can't bring this up. Maybe I should bring it up. Yeah, well, maybe I'll lose my job if I do. But it's really important that I bring this up. But oh my gosh, all these people are getting laid off. I can't afford to lose my job. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and I'm going to stay between the lines, and I'm going to do exactly what I'm told to do, nothing outside of that. And I'm going to always kind of have the aim being that the people I'm reporting to are never made to look foolish or like they've done something wrong. My sense is that there have been a lot of people in a culture in different offices who have come to the place where they think that that's how it works for them at their job or at their department or at their agency or whatever. That they think that the best thing to do is just only the job description as defined. And so that sort of explains how when a question comes up, well, have you tested the lead levels in the water in the elementary schools? And the answer is, well, that doesn't fall under our department. And, you know, when you hear that the first time, you're like, what? You're in charge of lead in the water that people drink. And it's not in your department, so you didn't check the schools. What? Unless what I'm trying to just do is my job and only my job. And if I talk about the water in the schools, I don't have any control over that. It's just going to make somebody mad at me, and I need my job. Now, I don't want to put those thoughts and words into people's heads. I mean, I don't want to say that that's what's happened. You know, those of you who know me well know that given the option, I will always choose an explanation that holds people as human and as basically wanting good and as basically driven to help one another. That is in me. That's who I am. And so I'm always looking for an answer to how things go the way they go that could preserve that. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case, but as you'll see as I go through this timeline, a lot of similar themes of, well, according to the law, according to that rule, according to what was the last revised version of that statement, instead of based on what I see, I've seen a lot of statements that are prefaced with that kind of a phrase, and I don't think it's just about liability. I think it's about a culture, and perhaps it's a culture that can end. And perhaps it's a culture that's a product of the emergency manager law. Perhaps it's a culture that's a product of a certain administration. I don't know. I don't think it's just in government. I have had students who've talked about this as being a challenge for them at work. So I think it's a culture that we encounter, and the key here is how do you deal with that kind of a culture? So I love this. I think it's from the Talmud, but I've seen it attributed a lot of different places. This quote: "Don't be daunted. First and foremost, you see a situation that looks beyond one person's ability to do anything good about, don't be daunted. Don't turn around and say, this is just too big for me. Don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief, because you know what? It's everywhere. It's not just in Flint. You're not obligated to finish this. You're not obligated to fix this. Not any one of you, not all of you together. We're not obligated to finish this work. But if you ask me, based on my faith, based on who I am, I'm on this planet to participate in the process of healing the people and the planet, and I'm never free to abandon the work of doing that. The middle part I've seen in a lot of other places, and I think that this is sort of maybe the key to the compass of all right, how do I know if I'm going in the right direction? And I think as I talk about the whistleblowers who I've interfaced with over this time, I've found that a common theme among those individuals are that they do justice. And that's not the same as judging. That means act justly. They do justice consistently. Secondly, they love mercy. They're willing to forgive. They're trying to mend. They're trying to move. They're trying to make things better and not engage in rage and liability. And thirdly, they're humble. They're not going to be on the TV. They're not going to be on CNN. They're not going to be on every billboard. That's a sign that there's another motive. I'm not saying that if they're everywhere, they have the wrong motive, but I'm saying that if your motive is to do these things, justice and mercy, with humility, chances are you're a good whistleblower. And if you're looking for somebody or whether or not to listen to somebody, and you use those three metrics, I think you might come out helping to identify who's an opportunist, who's looking for fame, and who really does have a concern and a valid idea. So, as Terry said, and you know, people, yesterday somebody asked me my age, and I was like, okay, what year is it? Which is not uncommon. But then I had to ask, wait, what month is it? Because truly, those of us who have been in this, deep in this, we have lost track of the season. You know, I mean, it's like, okay, tomorrow, what's tomorrow? And I can tell you, I'm beginning to understand that thing that happens in people that causes this lack of self-determination, a lack of even thinking about a year from now. Because you're so consumed in today and tomorrow and getting by and figuring it out. But in the fall of 2014, students in then Engineers Without Borders, now SAGE, began to come to me and say, Professor Sullivan, we should do something about the people in Flint who are having their water turned off. Because we go to other countries to help people have water, so we should do something about people who don't have water here. And so we began exploring different possible ways of bringing water, of setting up rain barrels, of some way to get people water not to drink, but so that they could flush their toilets, so they wouldn't be evicted, so their children wouldn't be taken and put in foster care, because that's what's happened. We were just looking for a way to be able to stay in their house. Because we know from our experience in third world work that if you get to the point where people don't have hygiene, don't have sanitation, because they can't flush their toilets anymore, now you have the potential of massive disease, complete lack of control over public health. And so what we were going for here was not to try to get people water to drink, but just to try to maintain some level of sanitation in the town where we lived. Okay? And so we began working with the activists, and especially with a lot of the very active clergy in the city of Flint. Flint has a rich history in its clergy, having started or participated strongly in the fair housing movement. A very vibrant, a very political, a very powerful group of clergy throughout the city. So we began to meet and talk about, well, what can we do? How can we help people not lose their children more than anything? But certainly be able to stay in a house, be able to maintain sanitation. And so this is the fall of 2014, and we're meeting, and I quickly become the person in the room who is trying to get everybody to reason with me. I become the person in the room who's saying, oh, no, calm down. No, they really didn't intend to do that to you, right? I become the person in the room that says, no, just because General Motors doesn't want to use the water for their cutting operations doesn't mean it's bad for you to drink. And I'm serious. I was absolutely certain that there was nothing wrong with the water. I know the history of the Flint River, and I know there's dead bodies in the river, and I know there's cars in the river, and I know the history of the river and the dumping, but I also know water treatment. And we had a water treatment plant, yeah, and we hadn't used one before, ever. We had a water treatment plant. It was there, it had been there a long time. It was a secondary water treatment plant for all those years that we were getting treated water from Detroit. And we had just outfitted it to be able to treat river water. So it's a brand new deal, right? And I would almost slap the hands of anybody who said the word corrosive. No, it's not corrosive. And I went and called people in General Motors, and they said the deal here is that we recycle that water that we use. We recycle it 4 or 5 times, and by the time it's at that 4th time, it's super concentrated in whatever was in the water that we were using. So I come back to the actors, here's the thing, they're adding cutting fluid and that kind of stuff, and it's getting concentrated every time. And there's something different about the water, but it's not so major. It's not bad to drink. It's okay. I live in Flint. I was drinking the water. I was bathing in the water. So I felt I could say that. I mean, it's not like trying to tell them, don't worry about something that I didn't participate in. And then January 4th, I got a notice, as did every resident in Flint, that said that there was the acronym is TTHM. There was a chemical in the water, in the municipal water, that had reached levels high enough that the residents had to be notified that it was present. And you may have heard TTHM. That's an acronym for total trihalomethanes. Halo, anybody in chemistry here? Halo means chlorine, bromine, fluorine. Okay, so tri and bi, chloro, fluoro, bromo, methane. Family of things. These are called disinfectant byproducts. They are an issue throughout the world. There is one good way of disinfecting water other than boiling it, and that is chlorine. That's the one good way, and it's, thank goodness for chlorine, because we wouldn't be able to fight and resist all the kinds of things that we had to resist before it. But turns out if you add chlorine to water and there's organic material in the water, dirt, dust, wood, tiny pieces of that material, chlorine will bind to those pieces and form one of the trihalomethanes. It's a disinfectant byproduct. It's a byproduct of adding chlorine to water. And the way you avoid having that happen is filtering the water with something like activated charcoal, so that the organic material isn't present. If the organic material isn't present, you can put the chlorine in. That doesn't happen. Okay, so 8 spots throughout the city where this is monitored on a quarterly basis. And it's monitored on a quarterly basis because of the switch in the water source. So in April 2014, the city chose to switch from receiving the treated water from Detroit to taking its own river watering and treating it locally. Because of the change in source, the law says at that point, every 3 months, the city had to collect information about the presence of those disinfectant byproducts. They have 8 places that they look at those levels. So the switch was in April. In May, they went to the 8 places. 6 of those 8 places had high levels of that disinfectant byproduct. But the law says that the residents have to know when the annual average is high. And no, that's just one time. That's hardly an annual. So the public wasn't informed. In August, 3 months later, that level was elevated at every site. And the complicating thing was that we also happened to have, because of a water main break, an E. coli alert and the need to boil water. Now, when you have bacteria in the water and we know it's present, then the only safe thing to do is to boil your water before you cook, or well, before you drink it. Problem is that boiling the water kills bacteria. But for every other contaminant, it only concentrates it, right? Because you're getting rid of the pure water and steam. So the public did not know that there was this high level of disinfectant byproduct throughout the city in all of the locations. Public didn't know that, as the public was told to boil the water. In November, 3rd quarter, it was no longer high in 8 places, it was only high in 2 or 4 places, I can't recall. And somebody at the level of Public Works decided that that was a sign that it was getting better, without thinking about the fact that it was because the ground was frozen. Because the organic material, at least some of that organic material in the water, was present in the summer months because of runoff and rain and so forth. And once the ground freezes, then you're not going to have as much organic material, and you're not going to have as much of the disinfectant byproduct. And so somebody thought, well, it's actually getting better. We still don't have to tell people. I don't know what the trigger was, but the 1st of January, everyone found out that it was high. It only took a bit more of investigating to find out it had been high for a while and hadn't been reported. And one flaw in this system now is the fact that because the city was under emergency manager, there was question about, well, whose role is it to report and who makes the decisions? And again, what's the rule on that? So the then mayor formed a technical advisory committee, and I was part of that group. And we met, and the consultant that was brought in to speak with the technical advisory committee was a company that's called Veolia, which privatizes the water supply throughout the world, and which I have experience with in the third world as a company that will work with corrupt governments to secure the rights to the water away from the people. So I was really alarmed by that. At that meeting, a number of physicians showed up, uninvited. A number of physicians showed up because the facilities per person at the hospitals, each hospital had a facilities person that was invited. So a lot of doctors came. And their reason for coming and their complaint was that the notice that had been sent out had said, if you have small children, if you have a compromised immune system, if you're pregnant, if you're elderly, you might want to talk to your doctor about whether or not you should drink bottled water. The problem was that no one in the city had contacted anybody in the health community to know that the warning was going out. So the physicians were pretty irritated because they were getting phone calls about whether or not they should drink bottled water when they didn't know there was an issue. And so they were telling people, yeah, probably you should drink bottled water. And then when they found out the reason why, some of them changed the message to their patients and said, no, actually it's okay, you're young, you're not at risk, you're fine. But by then we had already started to really congeal a group of residents who felt they couldn't trust was being told. And what they heard was a doctor saying, yes, you should drink bottled water. No, I changed that, you're okay. And so there were many residents who thought that the medical community was getting somehow bought. There were people in this meeting, this advisory board meeting, who insisted that these disinfectant byproducts are only a problem if over a lifetime you're exposed to them. And they had a few conference and literature papers to show that was true. It didn't take very long for me to find twice as many that said, no, actually it might be a problem, which I presented by email to the group, and we didn't meet again, not for a while. Come now, so that's winter. Spring 2015, in this advisory meeting, I hear this anti-corrosive word coming out, and I said, I'm a metallurgist. When the next time you get a broken pipe, could I have a piece of that? My students and I, this would be a great project. My students and I could dig a cross-section, we could find out what's going on in the pipe. No, that's not necessary. We got that covered. We don't need, no, you won't need to see any of the pipe. So I began to start thinking, what could there be other issues going on with that pipe? Especially when I saw Veolia say, you need to add activated charcoal to the Flint treatment plant. That was the reason we were having problems with disinfectant byproducts, is the company that had designed the treatment plant had failed to put any activated charcoal in the plant. And oh, you should probably be looking at a corrosion inhibitor. So I started thinking, okay, corrosion inhibitor, I should make a mental note of that. And in the meetings I started hearing about people who have lead pipes. And I was thinking, oh, they must mean ductile iron. They must mean iron that has some lead in it, because nobody would have solid lead pipes. But in fact, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 of the houses in Flint have solid lead pipes, or at one point did. Solid lead pipes. So I started asking questions about the pH. Is the water acidic? If the water's acidic, then we could maybe use that word corrosive, and maybe there is some of that metal coming out of the inside of the pipe if the water's acidic. It wasn't. But anybody who was paying attention to what was coming out of the hydrants was seeing every month orange, more and more orange water. Thank goodness that iron oxidizes orange. Because that was a wonderful orange flag. That was a warning sign. And it wasn't because the Flint water had all that rust in it or all that lead in it. The water leaving the plant was fine, except for one very important thing. It had 19 times the salt content that the lake did. It has salt in it because we live on a salt mine. The rocks below us have all kinds of salt in them, and the water coming down the river was picking up salt. Some of it dissolved in the water. Add to that a fraction of salt coming from de-icing. How do you get rid of salt that's in water, dissolved in water? Can you filter it through a filter? Anybody come up with a way to get salt out of water without having to boil it or some other kind of chemical process? You have a lot of money to make. Because if we could do that, we would be all set with the ocean water around to be able to desalinate. No, you can't get salt out of water. You can't filter salt out of water. And nobody really, I don't think, knew to think about taking the salt out of the water. Add to that the fact that, for whatever reason, the company that designed this modifications of the treatment plant to deal with the river water, for whatever reason, chose not to even put in the machine that would dispense a corrosion inhibitor. It was not at all even included, even though it's a standard practice, all water, not just river water, to have dispensed corrosion inhibitor when necessary. So because there was no corrosion inhibitor, and because we have water that's got all those ions in it, the metal on the inside of the pipes was free to leave the surface. Not to be corroded off the surface, but just to leave the surface and join all those ions because of the salty nature of the water. And there wasn't anything to protect the surface. So a corrosion inhibitor, typically phosphate, combines with the metal at the surface and makes a hard scale. So that once that scale's formed, no more water can touch the metal underneath the scale. And when metal pipes are put in municipal distribution systems, always phosphate, or maybe something more exotic and more expensive, is used to set that scale on the inside of all metal pipes, because, unless we're going to make our pipes out of gold, most of the metals that are used in distribution systems do oxidize in water over time. They rust or corrode or whatever the word you want to use. And so what happened was the salt content that wasn't removed, and then the lack of phosphates to make sure that there is a protective surface over time dissolved off the scale that was protecting the pipes. And once it was dissolved off, well, then it could rust. And then you saw more and more and more rust in the water. And in there with that iron rust is also copper, oxidized copper, and lead. Because there are three main kinds of materials used in the pipes: copper, galvanized steel, and lead. And so in the spring, one of the biggest, most active activists in this whole movement, Leanne Walters' son, ended up in the hospital diagnosed with some form of cancer because there appeared to be no hemoglobin. And that's because lead is much more likely to attach itself to the hemoglobin than iron is. And if there's lead in the water, then the lead will go and attach itself to those sites on the red blood cell that hold oxygen, which hold iron, which carry oxygen. If you drank water that had lead in it, so that it caused you to be deprived of some of the hemoglobin oxygen, you would have symptoms of anemia. And you would be more tired, you would have low oxygen. If you were a child whose brain hasn't yet developed, because by the way, brains don't develop fully when a person's born. It takes 6, 8, 10 years for the brain to develop. So if your brain is still growing, and I give you water or anything that deprives you of oxygen, now I am killing. That's a neurotoxin. I am doing damage to your brain. So that's what was happening. And this little guy was having significant symptoms of lead poisoning. Eventually it was determined he had lead poisoning. And so we started paying a lot more attention and asking a lot more questions about lead. I said that every quarter they have to collect the water tests for the byproducts. Also, when they change the water source, every 6 months, they have to collect, well, depending on the population in Flint, they have to collect 60 water samples for lead. 60 residents' water samples for lead every 6 months have to be collected. And once they're collected for a given 6 months, by law, any of those 60 that had elevated lead have to be returned to monitor, by law. Safe Drinking Water Act, law. And who manages that? The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Every state has an entity that manages the Clean Water Act and makes sure that it's followed in all municipalities. So in the first 6 months, they did that. They actually got 100 because they thought that they were supposed to get 100. And there were 12 that had lead levels above 15 parts per billion, which is an actionable level, but nobody returned to those homes. What we hear was, we called and they didn't answer the phone. As of the 1st of May, 2015, when they needed another 6 months at the end of June, as of the 1st of May, they had about 30. They hadn't actively gone to look for any. And I don't know if you recall, but on the news, it started to come up on the news, hey, get your water tested. Go and here's a number to call, we'll bring you a test, or go to the water treatment plant to pick up a test or drop off a test. Get your water tested. And the message was because of this disinfectant byproduct. But part of the reason was because we didn't have the tests we were supposed to have for lead. And so the activists said, we're going to help with that. We're going to call people and we're going to encourage people to get their water tested, and we're going to ask them to share their results with us so that we have some sense of where those numbers are. So by the end of June, we had maybe 20 tests. And the average was way above 15. And so we had some numbers here. We were reasonably concerned. We had a reason to be worried. This wonderfully powerful political group of clergy called the governor. They called the person that works with the governor who they know, and they got a meeting. And some of the activists and I and the clergy went and met with the chief of staff in July of last year. And we talked about, hey, we're really worried about this. We got some of these numbers. We're worried about the implications of this. He was honestly concerned, demonstrated that, said, I'm going to look into this and get it back to you. 2 weeks later, we come back, and the two DEQ people who were just charged yesterday were in the room, and they said with their graph, the 90th percentile value for Flint is 11 parts per billion. So you take, if you had 100 tests, you'd line them up, and number 90 is supposed to be less than 15. If it's more than 15, if the 90th percentile value is higher than 15, that's an action. That means somebody's got to do something. Look into it, fix it. We had a sense, based on 20, that the 90th percentile would be something around 20, 25. And he says, oh, no worries, it's 11. With, I have to say, a sneer and it's okay, just relax. I don't know if I'll ever feel like I have to do more to make up for not saying something right then. I was not a whistleblower. I was shocked, and I was pretty intimidated because I was sitting right next to the chief of staff. I should have said, wrong, but I didn't. Fortunately, there had already been a whistleblower, and that man's name is Miguel Del Toro. Miguel is an employee of the EPA. Leanne Walters, whose son was so terribly ill, was going to not stop until she figured out what was going on. And so she just started going online and looking up people's phone numbers. And she was able to reach Miguel, who worked for the Office of Research and Development in Cincinnati for the EPA. EPA has different offices: research office, regional offices, enforcement offices. But the EPA is really not allowed to get involved. That's by law, because this is the United States and we work independent. We're states. States have the right to govern themselves and not have the federal government take control. And so the law says the EPA can only get involved if it's demonstrated that the entity at the state level that's supposed to do things isn't doing it. And believe me, they were calling. We're hearing about some issues there on the ground. You're using a corrosion inhibitor? Oh yeah, we're using a corrosion inhibitor. Okay, gosh, all right, fine. So Miguel came. He was on his family vacation up to Mackinac Island, and he stopped at her house. And he took samples. And when he got back to EPA and he tested them, they were above toxic waste level. After she'd already been told it's probably lead paint, or maybe your kids are playing in the dirt, because there's a lot of lead out in the soil around Flint. And it turns out that every summer, because there's a lot of lead in the soil and in the paint, and window sills and so forth, every summer the lead levels in children do go up. And the good news is, because 42% of the population here lives below the poverty line, and because by law, any child who's receiving federal assistance has to have his or her blood lead level tested every 6 months for the first 2 years of life, we had data on that. And we had data that showed over time the lead levels in children's blood was gradually dropping, but every summer it jumped up a little bit and then went back down again. So, with leaving the office of the governor and feeling really, really hopeless and somewhat angry, we benefited from making a connection between Miguel Del Toro from the EPA, who had made these measurements, and a journalist, an investigative journalist who was working for the ACLU at the time on the emergency manager law. Okay, yeah, all right, gonna cut it close. And through that connection, we were connected with an expert at Virginia Tech who had gone straight to the EPA in Washington, D.C., because there is no DEQ at Washington, D.C. The EPA is in charge of the water there. So he has history. And he said, I'll come if you can get 100 residents to get water samples. And in a period of 10 days, we recruited 275 individuals to have their water tested, 3 samples per resident. It was at that point in time that my retina tore and I was kind of out of the loop for a while. But I'm talking about Professor Edwards, put together data to show that the 90th percentile level in Flint was 35. And much higher in specific areas of Flint, especially where the economic class was lower. And I don't know if you recall, but the media pretty much said, even local media, said, he can find lead anywhere. You know him, he doesn't practice science. He should do some real science. And I know that real science was a phrase because of some interactions I had here on campus with some administrators here on campus with concerns that I had, who told me, we'll talk about it and we'll use real science. Which was, I have to say, having been a professor of mechanical engineering for a number of years here, to be told that I needed to practice real science was a little bit irksome, might be the right word. But he was blown off. And then Dr. Larry Reynolds from Mott Children's Health Center, the head pediatrician, the chair of Mott Children's Health Center, called me. And he said, if I can get blood lead data by zip code, could I do a correlation between that and the water lead levels by zip code? And I said, here's the guy you call. Now, I'm not for a minute going to say that I'm the one that made that connection, because I think he probably checked with a lot of people before he went down that avenue. But you know that a few weeks later, Dr. Mona and Atisha got up before the cameras and said, here's the correlation. We have triple the blood lead levels in children who live in the zip codes that have high lead. And there was an attempt to say that she didn't practice real science. But because of, I'm going to say the clergy, and then a whistleblower in Miguel, who's this guy, humble, just, merciful, and an investigative reporter who can't even look you in the eye when you congratulate him. He is so humble. We got to the place where a lot of people, a lot of media people, a lot of national media people who don't even care about being humble, were ready to put Flint on the map and force the issue. And there are, last thing I want to say, there are lots of movements now that are attempting to let's just not talk so much about that. We hear enough about the lead in the water in Flint. There are parts of Flint that you've never been to. I know it, because I've never been there. And you really don't want to be there. You won't feel safe there. You'll feel guilty. You'll feel helpless. You will feel daunted, because the enormity of the world's grief lives in North Flint. I'm not ready to be quiet about it. I'm not ready to move on. And if anybody has a contact with anybody who really would just like #FlintForward for us to just talk about, oh yeah, Flint had that water problem, but that's over. Anybody who knows anybody who's pushing that message, I really dearly like to have a meeting. Because that message is causing the Flint legislature to say, oh, no, the problem's getting better. And further, nationally, the message to be, oh no, I saw a video and things are getting better. I think that the wealthy people who want us to move forward need to help us to move forward by fixing the problem. I'm working with the general on lead service line replacements. We're about ready to launch the next 400 lead service line replacements. And then we'll start inviting residents to self-enroll their own homes so that we can test for lead in their water. Starting May 1st, we're asking residents to flush their lines for 5 minutes and their kitchen faucet, and 5 minutes in their bathroom, so that we can move the particulate lead out. And we've worked to get at least a temporary promise from the state that residents won't have to pay for that water. So we are moving forward. And it's not worse. We're just looking at it. I just would like to ask that we all together look at it in the spirit of solving it, not suing, and not being an opportunist with some new product, but fixing it. and because we are part of this city. Thank you.